Prompter on.
You are live.
From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we advise you right at the outset to outfit yourself with a fat plate of haggis and a nice tall glass of whiskey because, as the critical drinker once said to Tatiana, we are going in long, deep, and hard on this one. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to The Last Radius. Thanks ever so much for joining us tonight. Now, when people discuss the real-world history behind A Song of Ice and Fire, the standard shorthand is to say that George R.R. Martin took the dynastic confusion of the anarchy, mixed it with the Wars of the Roses, added some dragons, and called the resulting cocktail Westeros. And that certainly is true to an extent. The anarchy supplied the disputed succession of female claimant, a rival male claimant, several decades in which the English nobility discovered that civil war was an excellent opportunity to do all the things that kings normally discouraged. The Wars of the Roses supplied the competing dynasties, the boy kings, the sinister uncles, the shifting allegiances, the mysterious deaths, and the general principle that a man's oath of loyalty remained legally binding until somebody offered him a better estate. But if you want to find the place where a great many of the nuts and bolts of Westeros actually existed, you have to travel north. You have to go to Scotland. And not the Scotland of tartan, gift shops, shortbread tins, golf resorts, and Americans explaining that they are 1/32nd mech something or other on their mother's side. I'm talking about the Scotland of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The Scotland before 1603, when James VI inherited the English throne and departed for London, promising to come home frequently before discovering that England had more money and considerably fewer people attempting to stab him. For anyone unfamiliar with Scottish royal history before the Union of the Crowns, the first encounter with it can be genuinely disorienting because it is so bloody, so tragic, and so relentlessly improbable that, had it been presented as fiction, no sensible publisher would have accepted it. The kings are assassinated or killed in battle or blown apart by their own artillery. The queens are deposed. Their heirs are usually infants. The regents murder one another. The nobles invite their rivals to dinner and execute them in between courses. Entire families rise from obscurity, dominate the kingdom, and are then destroyed so thoroughly that a few generations later, their former castles have been converted into scenic locations for wedding photographs. And through all of it, the Scottish crown is attempting to govern not merely a collection of rebellious subjects, but a geography that seems to have been specifically designed to prevent centralized government. Mountains, islands, sea locks, border country, remote valleys controlled by families whose practical relationship with the king was somewhere between heavily qualified allegiance and outright mocking sarcasm. There was an enormous difference between being King of Scots and actually being obeyed by Scotsmen. That distinction is also the central political fact of Westeros. The Iron Throne supposedly rules the Seven Kingdoms, but the North remembers. The Vale closes its mountain passes. Dorne follows its own customs. The Iron Islands elect kings whenever they think nobody is looking. And every great lord considers himself a loyal servant of the crown, provided the crown never asks him to do anything inconvenient. This is why Martin's world feels different from so much conventional fantasy. Its politics are not merely decorative obstacles placed between the heroes and the next battle. They are rooted in the way actual pre-modern states functioned. Power is personal, authority is negotiated, communication is slow, loyalty is conditional. And the king may possess the legal right to command 10,000 men while discovering at the moment when he needs them that 9,700 of them have developed prior commitments. Martin's greatest contribution to the human cultural canon may be that he built a fantasy world anchored first and foremost in real places, real people, and real events. The supernatural elements, they don't replace history, they are inserted into it. Even the dragons can be understood as something more intellectually interesting than a mere flight of high fantasy. They are, you might say, a tactical thought experiment. They are the answer to a historical counterfactual. Namely, what would the Norman conquest have looked like if William the Conqueror had possessed an air force? The answer is that the Battle of Hastings would have been considerably shorter. Every castle in southern England would have become an outdoor fireplace, and the Bayeux Tapestry would contain several extremely confused horses staring upward. That is essentially what Aegon the Conqueror represents. Not merely a fantasy king with 3 magical animals, but a medieval warlord who has suddenly acquired a weapon system against which the existing military, political, and architectural order has no effective defenses. The dragons are fantastic. The uses to which human beings put them are mostly entirely historical, and the same is true of almost everything else in Westeros. The child monarchs, the murderous regents, the semi-independent island princes, the great houses whose wealth rivals that of the crown, the sacred promises of protection that cease to matter the moment they become politically inconvenient, the weddings that end in funerals. For those, we need not search beyond the wall. We only need to cross the River Tweed. Because long before there were Starks, Lannisters, Greyjoys, or Targaryens, there were Stuarts, Douglases, Campbells, MacDonalds, and a succession of Scottish kings who appear to have regarded peaceful death from old age as an embarrassing foreign innovation. This evening, therefore, on the other side of the open, we present here for your kind consideration Curmudgeon's Field Guide to Scottish Westeros.
I'm frozen.
Shit.
You press a button, it's frozen. It's not doing nothing. I'll be right back.
Well, now I've got a problem. Which button do I press? God damn it!
Too tactical, Duke. Do we go to it? I don't have a quote. We didn't do that. We screw everything up. Wait, let's just do the intro and you can come back doing your thing and I'll be back as soon as I can. I think it'll work. Come on, work.
The first thing to understand about medieval Scotland is that the king ruled considerably more of it on parchment than he did in practice. This was not necessarily because the king was weak, although, as we shall see, being 6 years old, imprisoned in England, murdered by one's relatives, or unexpectedly converted into cannon debris could occasionally interfere with effective government. The larger problem was that Scotland itself appeared to have been geographically engineered to frustrate anyone attempting to govern it. The country was divided by mountains, glens, forests, lochs, islands, and vast stretches of countryside in which a royal messenger could disappear for several weeks and return with nothing but trench foot and a revised opinion of centralized authority. Edinburgh might issue the order, but between the king issuing said order and somebody in the Highlands obeying it stood several mountain ranges, 3 clan chiefs, 2 disputed inheritances, and a local nobleman who claimed never to have received the letter, or who received it, read it, and decided that the king had obviously meant it for someone else. This was a kingdom of regions with profoundly different histories and political cultures. The fertile lowlands contained the royal boroughs, the great abbeys, much of the kingdom's wealth, and the political centers from which Scottish kings attempted to exercise their authority. To the south lay the borders, where powerful riding families existed in a state of nearly continuous feud with one another and regarded the Anglo-Scottish frontier less as an international boundary than as a convenient professional opportunity. To the north and the west were the highlands and the islands, where the authority of local chiefs was often more immediate, more personal, and significantly better armed than the authority of a distant king. And beyond the sea locks lay the Hebrides, whose inhabitants had spent centuries moving between Gaelic and Norse worlds and were not necessarily overwhelmed by the majesty of a crown in Edinburgh. There were places where the King of Scots was unquestionably king. There were other places where he was more of a strongly worded suggestion. This is one of the great realities underlying the political world of Westeros. The Iron Throne claims dominion over the 7 kingdoms, but Westeros is not truly one kingdom. It is a collection of old kingdoms whose rulers have been persuaded, conquered, married, threatened, or incinerated into acknowledging the same sovereign. The North remains the North. Dorne remains Dorne. The Iron Islands remain a floating criminal conspiracy with a flag. The Vale can close its mountain roads. The great houses command their own fortresses, collect their own revenues, administer their own justice, and maintain private armies ostensibly belonging to the king in roughly the same sense that a man's hunting dog belongs to the neighbor who occasionally whistles at it. That was the essential weakness of medieval monarchy. The king did not possess anything resembling a modern state. He possessed relationships. He ruled through oaths, marriages, offices, favors, hostages, personal loyalties, and the understanding that disobedience might eventually result in the arrival of several thousand men with ladders. His authority was only as strong as his ability to reward his friends, punish his enemies, and prevent his friends from realizing they might be more powerful than he was. And in Scotland, that realization occurred with remarkable frequency. The great magnates were not merely wealthy landowners, they were regional powers. They had castles, tenants, armed retainers, family alliances, and hereditary grievances dating back to a period before anyone involved could remember what the original argument had been about in the first place. A significantly powerful earl could negotiate with England, intimidate royal officials, shelter fugitives, ignore summonses, and force the king to choose between compromise and civil war. This was especially dangerous whenever the crown passed into the hands of a child, and the Scottish crown passed to children with the regularity of an inherited medical condition. When the king was a minor, somebody had to govern in his name. That meant controlling access to the royal person. Whoever possessed the young king could appoint officials, distribute patronage, issue commands under the royal seal, and accuse his rivals of treason with the confidence of a man standing beside the only person legally empowered to disagree. The child king, therefore, became both sovereign and hostage. He was the source of authority, but not necessarily its wielder. Around him, great families maneuvered for control of the court, the treasury, the castles, and of the king himself. The result was a political order instantly recognizable to anyone who has watched Cersei Lannister circle a young boy wearing a crown. But even when the king reached adulthood, the problem did not disappear. A mature king still had to bargain with men who controlled whole regions of the country. He had to break alliances before they became rebellions. He had to prevent one noble house from becoming so powerful that the monarchy existed only by its permission. And above all, he had to make certain that when he invited those nobles to dinner, everyone understood which party was expected to survive dessert. Because in 15th century Scotland, the royal banquet was not merely a social occasion, it was an extremely elaborate form of pest control. Chapter 2, The Black Dinner. In November of 1440, the most powerful noble family in Scotland received an invitation to dinner. Historically speaking, this should already make us nervous. James II had inherited the Scottish throne 3 years earlier following the assassination of his father. He was 6 years old. which meant that Scotland was technically ruled by a king who had only recently reached the age at which a modern child can be trusted to operate a toaster. The actual government of the kingdom had fallen into the hands of competing noble factions, each one claiming to protect the young monarch while attempting to obtain control of his person, his castles, his patronage, and the royal seal. Among the greatest obstacles confronting them was the House of Douglas. The Douglases were not merely another noble family. By the middle of the 15th century, the senior branch, known to history as the Black Douglases, had accumulated an enormous concentration of land, wealth, military power, and political influence. Their estates stretched across southern Scotland. Their followers numbered in the thousands. Their family had produced some of the greatest military heroes of the Wars of Independence, and their chief was William Douglas, 6th Earl of Douglas, who was approximately 16 years old. So Scotland found itself in the peculiar position of having a 10-year-old king whose government was threatened by a 16-year-old magnate. This is medieval politics in its purest form. Nobody involved is old enough to rent a horse, but between them, they control most of the kingdom. William and his younger brother David were invited to Edinburgh Castle, ostensibly so that the young earl might meet the young kings, and the two boys could establish a relationship of friendship and cooperation. It was presented as an act of reconciliation. The Douglases would enter under the king's protection. Old suspicions would be set aside. The most powerful noble house in Scotland would be brought peacefully into the royal circle, and everyone would enjoy a pleasant meal in a heavily fortified building controlled by their political enemies. According to later tradition, the dinner began cordially. The boys ate together. The young king and the young earl apparently got along well. Then, as the meal approached its end, a drum began to beat. A covered dish was carried into the hall and placed before William Douglas. The covering was removed, and upon the table lay the severed head of a black bull, the traditional symbol of death. Now, the bull's head is one of those details that must be handled with historical care. It comes to us from accounts written long after the event and may have been added by later chroniclers who understood that an atrocity benefits from good stage management. But it has endured because it is almost too perfect. It transforms political murder into ritual. The feast stops being merely a trap and becomes a performance. The victims are not simply killed, they are informed through symbolism that the rules of hospitality have now ended and death has entered the room. Whether the bull's head was truly placed before them or supplied later by the Scottish Department of Dramatic Embellishment, what followed is not in any doubt. William and David Douglas were seized. They were dragged from the table. They were subjected to a hurried mock trial on charges of treason, and despite the alleged protests of the 10-year-old king, both brothers were taken into the courtyard of Edinburgh Castle and duly beheaded. Their friend Malcolm Fleming of Cumbernauld was also executed. The entire purpose of the invitation had been to separate the young Earl of Douglas from his followers and bring him inside a fortress where the government could destroy him without fighting his army. It was a decapitation strike in both the political and unusually literal senses. The principal figure traditionally blamed for the plot is Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor of Scotland and keeper of Edinburgh Castle. Alexander Livingston, another of the magnates competing for control of the young king, may also have been involved. Responsibility remains disputed in its finer details, but the fundamental political calculation is clear. The Black Douglases had become too powerful to confront openly, so they were offered peace, brought beneath the king's roof, and murdered under the protection of royal hospitality, which brings us, inevitably, to the Red Wedding. George Martin has identified the Black Dinner as one of the historical events behind the slaughter at the Twins, combined with the later massacre of Glencoe, and then amplified into the catastrophe visited upon Robb Stark, Catelyn Stark, and their followers. The parallels are obvious. A powerful but vulnerable noble house receives an invitation under assurances of peace. Its leaders enter a fortified residence, believing the customs of hospitality will protect them. The meal becomes a trap. Music or drumming signals the change, and the hosts eliminate by treachery the enemies they could not defeat or did not wish to confront on the battlefield. But the Black Dinner contains an additional cruelty that is absent from the Red Wedding. At the Twins, Walder Frey is the architect of the betrayal. At Edinburgh Castle, the supposed host was a 10-year-old boy. James II wore the crown. The executions were committed in his name. The victims were taken from his table. but the king himself appears to have possessed no meaningful ability to prevent them. He was sovereign enough to legitimize the murder, but not sovereign enough to stop it. That is the true nightmare of a royal minority. The child is not merely manipulated by the adults around him, he becomes their instrument. His authority is used to reward their allies, punish their enemies, seize their lands, and sanctify their crimes. The crown remains on his head, but the hands directing it belong to someone else entirely. And somewhere inside Edinburgh Castle, young James II learned one of the foundational lessons of Scottish kingship. If a noble family becomes too powerful to control, invite it to dinner. It was a lesson that he would remember. Unfortunately, the next time the House of Douglas entered a royal castle under promises of safety, James would no longer be the helpless boy watching from the table. He would be the man holding the knife. Chapter 3. The King Who Learned the Wrong Lesson. 12 years after the Black Dinner, another Earl of Douglas received another invitation to a royal castle. Apparently, the family had not yet developed a sufficiently robust policy regarding Scottish dinner invitations. The victim this time was William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas. He was not the teenage earl murdered at Edinburgh in 1440, but a cousin who had inherited the title after the senior Douglas line passed through several premature deaths. And under his leadership, the Black Douglases had recovered with astonishing speed. The family remained immensely wealthy. Its lands stretched across large portions of southern Scotland. Its castles commanded strategically important territory. Its retainers constituted something uncomfortably close to a private army. And William Douglas had married Margaret Douglas, known as the Fair Maid of Galloway, thereby uniting still more Douglas property and influence under his control. This was not merely a powerful nobleman. This was a man assembling the resources of an alternative government. By 1452, James II was 21 years old. He had reached adulthood, taken control of his kingdom, and developed a very clear idea of what had gone wrong during his childhood. The crown had been weak. The great families had been strong. Men such as Crichton, Livingston, and Douglas had treated possession of the young king as a means of controlling Scotland. James had no intention of remaining a decorative object in somebody else's castle. He was determined to build a monarchy capable of ruling in fact as well as in theory, and that meant breaking the power of the Black Douglases. The immediate crisis centered upon a political alliance. Douglas had entered into a bond with Alexander Lindsay, Earl of Crawford, one of the dominant magnates of northeastern Scotland, and John Macdonald, Lord of the Isles, ruler of the great maritime lordship in the west. Taken separately, each was formidable. Taken together, they represented something very close to the encirclement of the Scottish crown. Douglas dominated much of the south. Crawford possessed great influence in the northeast. The Lord of the Isles commanded the western seaways, the Hebrides, and extensive mainland territories. It was the sort of alliance that causes a king to study a map and discover that nearly every route out of his capital passes through land belonging to someone who intensely dislikes him. Whether the bond was explicitly intended as an alliance against James remains a matter of historical interpretation, but from the king's perspective, its precise wording was rather beside the point. 3 of the most powerful regional lords in Scotland had agreed to support one another, and they had neglected to ask permission from the man wearing the crown. So James summoned Douglas to Stirling Castle. The Earl, he was understandably reluctant. His family's previous experience of royal hospitality had ended with 2 severed heads in the courtyard of Edinburgh Castle. So James provided him with formal safe conduct. This was not merely an informal promise that everyone would behave. It was a written royal guarantee of protection. Douglas could come to Stirling, meet with the king, discuss their differences, and depart without harm. It was, in practical terms, the closest medieval Scotland could come to Westerosi guest right. The king's word stood between Douglas and violence. Douglas accepted the guarantee and entered the castle. At first, the meeting appears to have proceeded peacefully. The king received him with grace. The 2 men dined together. And once again, we arrive at the point in Scottish history where the meal has gone suspiciously well. After dinner, James confronted Douglas over the alliance. He demanded that the Earl dissolve his bonds with Crawford and the Lord of the Isles. But Douglas refused. Perhaps he believed the king would negotiate. Perhaps he believed his own power made him untouchable. Perhaps he simply trusted the guarantee of safe conduct. Whatever his reasoning, he underestimated the depth of James's anger. The discussion became an argument. The argument became a confrontation. And the King of Scots then drew a dagger and stabbed the Earl of Douglas right in the neck. At that moment, whatever legal distinction existed between monarchy and murder became largely academic. Once the king struck, members of his household joined in the attack. Douglas was stabbed repeatedly. One account claims that Sir Patrick Grey finished him off with a poleaxe. According to later tradition, the mutilated body was then thrown from a window of Stirling Castle. As with the bull's head at the Black Dinner, some of the theatrical details accumulated in later retellings. But the central fact requires no embellishment. William Douglas entered Stirling under the written protection of the king. He refused a royal demand, and James II personally initiated his murder. This was not an execution following a lawful conviction. It was not a death in battle. It was not even a carefully concealed assassination. The king lost his temper and stabbed a guest whose safety he had expressly guaranteed. In Westeros, the violation of guest right is presented as one of the most abominable acts imaginable because it destroys the fragile custom that permits enemies to meet without immediately reaching for their swords. Pre-modern politics depended on such guarantees. A king could not negotiate with powerful subjects unless those subjects believed they might survive the meeting. A noble could not surrender, submit, or answer a summons if the monarch's safe conduct meant absolutely nothing. Once the king's written protection became merely a decorative ornament, every political disagreement had to be resolved from behind castle walls. James may have removed one dangerous enemy, but he also announced to every magnate in Scotland that a royal promise remained valid only until the king became irritated. And the Douglases made certain that nobody forgot it. William's brother James inherited the earldom and denounced the murder. The family displayed the violated safe conduct as proof of the king's treachery. Douglas supporters attacked Stirling and publicly repudiated their allegiance. The political confrontation James had hoped to resolve inside the castle now expanded into open rebellion. Once again, the central question of Scottish government became a brutally simple one. Was the House of Douglas a subject of the crown, or was the crown merely one Scottish power among several? James II spent the next 3 years answering that question, and whatever else might be said of him, he did not lack in determination. He moved systematically against Douglas allies. Royal forces defeated the Earl of Crawford's faction in the northeast. James divided the opposition, pardoned defectors, offered rewards to wavering supporters, and demonstrated that medieval kingship involved as much bribery as swordsmanship. The Douglas coalition began to unravel. This was one of the great recurring weaknesses of noble alliances. They were formidable, while everyone believed victory would bring shared rewards, but they became much less impressive once defeat threatened to bring individual forfeiture. By 1455, James was ready to destroy the Black Douglases altogether. At the Battle of Arkenholm, Royalist forces defeated the remaining Douglas leadership. One brother was killed, another was captured and executed. The 9th Earl fled into English exile. The family's vast estates were forfeited to the crown. The Black Douglases, who had dominated Scottish politics for generations, ceased to exist as a serious independent power. James had succeeded where the regents of his childhood had failed. He broke the great house, he seized its lands, he strengthened the monarchy, and he demonstrated that the crown could destroy even the most powerful aristocratic family in Scotland. It was ruthless. It was politically effective, and it was about as close as the 15th century came to a successful hostile corporate takeover. This is where James II becomes such a fascinatingly Westerosi figure. He was neither simply a tyrant, nor simply a heroic centralizer. He was a king shaped by childhood trauma, aristocratic violence, and the knowledge that weakness at the center invited powerful men to govern in his name. He had watched royal authority become a weapon in the hands of others. As an adult, he determined that the weapon would remain in his own hands. The tragedy is that he adopted the methods of the men he had overcome. At 10 years old, James had allegedly begged for the lives of William and David Douglas as they were dragged from the Black Dinner. At 21, he drew the first blade against another William Douglas. The child who had watched men violate royal hospitality grew into the king who violated it personally. And yet, In the brutal logic of medieval kingship, the murder worked. The Douglases rebelled, but James defeated them. Their lands enriched the crown. Their destruction left the monarchy stronger than it had been in decades. History did not punish James for breaking his word. Rather, history rewarded him, at least temporarily. Because no Scottish king should ever become too confident that the immediate success of a policy indicated divine approval. James II emerged from the Douglas conflict young, virtuous, and increasingly powerful. He became an enthusiastic patron of Scotland's growing artillery train. Cannon offered precisely what an ambitious king required: the ability to reduce the fortified castles of rebellious noblemen who had previously been able to defy royal authority from behind stone walls. James loved his guns. He supervised them personally. And in 1460, while besieging the English-held Roxburgh Castle, one of those guns exploded right next to him. A fragment struck the king and killed him almost instantly. James II was 29 years old. The man who had survived the Black Dinner, destroyed the Black Douglases, and strengthened the Scottish monarchy, was blown apart by his own siege cannon, and the crown duly passed to his 9-year-old son, because in the House of Stuart, every apparent solution eventually produces yet another child king. Chapter 4. The Greyjoys of the Hebrides. If the Black Douglases were the great overmighty lords of the southern Scotland, the lords of the Isles represented a different and even more dangerous problem. They were not merely difficult subjects. They were the rulers of a parallel state. From their island strongholds in the Hebrides, the MacDonalds governed a maritime lordship stretching across much of western Scotland. Their domain included islands, coastal territories, sea routes, and mainland possessions linked less by roads than by ships. And this is an important distinction. A conventional medieval lord ruled land. The lord of the islands ruled water. The sea was not a barrier separating his territories, rather it was a highway connecting them. Where the Scottish crown saw a remote collection of islands lying inconveniently beyond the western mountains, the MacDonalds saw the center of their political world. Their power rested upon fleets, fortified islands, clan allegiance, and control of the channels running through the Hebrides. Edinburgh might be the capital of Scotland, but in the west, the center of gravity lay in places such as Finlaggan on Islay, where the lords of the Isles maintained their court and exercised authority with all the ceremony of independent princes. They appointed officials, they dispensed justice, they negotiated alliances, they rewarded followers, they commanded armed men, and they possessed a political identity rooted in the Norse Gaelic world of the western seaboard rather than in the lowland kingdom centered upon Edinburgh. The formal title was Lord of the Isles. The practical meaning was king of everything the King of Scots had difficulty reaching. The resemblance to the Ironborn is almost indecently convenient. The Greyjoys occupy a remote archipelago. They maintain a distinctive seafaring culture. They regard mainland politics with a mixture of contempt, opportunism, and poorly concealed envy. Their rulers acknowledge the Iron Throne when forced to do so, and rediscover the ancient independence of the islands whenever the central government appears to be distracted. Their power comes from ships. Their identity comes from isolation. And their long-term political strategy consists largely of waiting for everyone on the mainland to start killing one another. The MacDonalds were more sophisticated and politically embedded than the Greyjoys. They possessed extensive mainland interests and participated deeply in Highland affairs. But the structural resemblance remains nonetheless. Both were island dynasties nominally subject to a distant monarch. Both derived strength from naval mobility. Both operated within a culture distinct from the political heartland of the kingdom. And both had the unsettling habit of behaving like an independent foreign power despite technically residing inside the realm. This was the dilemma that confronted the Scottish crown. If the Lord of the Islands obeyed, he was an exceptionally valuable subject. He could project royal influence across the western seaways, contain rival clans, control strategic islands, and provide ships and fighting men. If he did not obey, the king had an enemy protected by mountains, water, distance, and a formidable navy. Sending a royal army west was not as simple as marching down a road and laying siege to a castle. The landscape favored local knowledge. The islands could be supplied by sea. The lordship could retreat, disperse, and reassemble. And every campaign risked ending with a lowland army standing on the wrong side of a sea lock while its enemies sailed away laughing. The Scottish monarchy therefore alternated between accommodation and confrontation. At times, the lords of the Isles were recognized, courted, married into the royal family, and incorporated into the structure of the kingdom. At other times, they were treated as rebels whose existence posed a fundamental challenge to royal sovereignty. This ambiguity was not accidental. Rather, it was the source of their power. The Lord of the Isles could represent himself as a loyal Scottish magnate when royal favor was useful. When the crown appeared weak, he could emphasize his hereditary independence, his Gaelic kingship traditions, and his ability to make arrangements with England. The most dramatic example came during the reign of James III. In 1462, John Macdonald, Lord of the Isles, entered into the Treaty of Westminster-Ardtornish with Edward IV of England. This was not a minor diplomatic flirtation. It was a proposal to partition Scotland. Under the agreement, John Macdonald and his allies would support an English invasion. If Edward successfully conquered the kingdom, large portions of Scotland would be divided among the conspirators. The Lord of the Isles would receive territory and recognition. The English king would receive overlordship, and James II would presumably receive whatever accommodations were traditionally offered to defeated medieval monarchs, usually involving a monastery, a dungeon, or an unexpectedly short staircase. This was treason on a scale impressive even by Scottish standards. The Lord of the Isles was not merely refusing a royal summons, he was negotiating with the enemy king over how best to divide the country whose monarch he supposedly served. Imagine Balon Greyjoy meeting secretly with the king beyond the wall and drawing lines across a map of Westeros. Then imagine everyone responding not with astonishment, but with the weary observation that this was exactly the sort of thing Balon Greyjoy did. That was the Macdonald problem. The lordship of the Isles was too powerful to ignore, too remote to control easily, and too useful to destroy without creating further instability in the West. But every concession made the lordship stronger. Every royal marriage increased its prestige. Every recognized privilege reinforced the idea that the Macdonalds were not merely one noble family among many, but the hereditary rulers of a separate political power. And there was another danger. The Lords of the Isles did not exist in isolation from the other great magnates. John Macdonald had been part of the alliance that so alarmed James II, the bond linking the lordship of the Isles with the Earl of Douglas and the Earl of Crawford. Once again, the crown faced enemies in several regions at once. Douglas in the south, Crawford in the northeast, Macdonald in the west. The combination resembled a Westerosi conspiracy assembled by selecting one difficult great house from every corner of the map. The alliance ultimately failed. James II destroyed the Black Douglases, Crawford submitted, and the Lord of the Isles survived by doing what island powers have always done best, remaining somewhere else while the mainland coalition collapsed. But the monarchy did not forget. Over the following decades, the crown moved steadily to reduce Macdonald power. Internal family disputes weakened the lordship. Royal officials encouraged rival claimants. The Scottish kings exploited divisions among the western clans. And John Macdonald's heir, Angus Ogg, challenged his father in a struggle that divided the Macdonald world against itself. This is another profoundly Westerosi feature of the story. A great house may appear impregnable from the outside, but give it two plausible heirs, one disputed marriage, and several ambitious cousins, and it will frequently destroy itself at no expense to the crown. By the reign of James IV, the monarchy was strong enough to act decisively. In 1493, the title Lord of the Isles was forfeited to the crown. John Macdonald surrendered his lordship. The great maritime principality that had dominated western Scotland for generations formally ceased to exist. The king had finally brought the islands beneath direct royal authority, at least on parchment. Because abolishing a title is not the same as abolishing the political world that sustained it. The clans remained, the geography remained, the sea routes remained, the rivalries remained, and the Western Highlands continued to resist easy government for centuries. The crown had removed the Greyjoy, it had not removed the Iron Islands. That is the recurring mistake of centralized monarchies. They assume that a difficult region is difficult because it possesses the wrong ruler. Remove the ruler, abolish the office, seize the castle, and the problem will disappear. But political systems grow out of geography, culture, and local power. The lordship of the Isles was not an administrative misunderstanding that could be corrected by royal decree. It was the product of a maritime landscape in which ships connected communities more effectively than roads. Local allegiance mattered more than distant law, and the King of Scots remained a remote figure somewhere beyond the mountains. James IV could claim the islands, his successors would still have to govern them. And Scottish kings were about to discover that controlling the western seaboard was only one item on a much larger list of hereditary disasters. Because while the MacDonalds were losing their lordship, the House of Stuart was perfecting its own contribution to Westeros, a royal dynasty in which nearly every king inherited young, died violently, or did both. Chapter 5, The Curse of the Five Jameses. The House of Stuart occupied the Scottish throne for more than 2 centuries. Its great achievement was continuity. Its preferred method of achieving continuity was for each king to die unexpectedly and leave the crown to a small child. Between 1406 and 1542, Scotland was ruled by 5 consecutive kings named James. Not one of them lived to see the age of 50. 4 of them inherited the throne before reaching adulthood. 3 died violently. 1 was killed by his own artillery. 1 died shortly after a catastrophic military defeat, and the dynasty concluded this sequence by handing the kingdom to a 6-day-old baby girl. If the Targaryens had produced this record, readers would complain that George Martin was becoming repetitive. The curse began with James I. He became King of Scots in 1406 at the age of 11 following the death of his father, Robert III. Unfortunately, James was not in Scotland. Shortly before Robert's death, the prince had been sent by sea toward France, partly for his own protection amid the murderous rivalries of the Scottish nobility. His ship was intercepted by English pirates. James was delivered to Henry IV of England, and so the new King of Scots began his reign as a prisoner of the country Scotland was perpetually fighting. This was inconvenient for James. It was considerably more inconvenient for the Scottish nobles who were governing in his absence. For the next 18 years, James remained in England while his uncle, Robert Stuart, Duke of Albany, and later Albany's son, exercised power in Scotland. James was not kept in a dungeon. He received the education of a prince. He learned literature, music, courtly manners, administration, and the military arts. He emerged intelligent, cultivated, energetic, and absolutely furious. When he finally returned to Scotland in 1424, he was 29 years old and determined to recover everything the monarchy had lost during his captivity. This included royal lands, royal revenues, royal authority, and, where possible, the lives of the people who had enjoyed them. James moved rapidly against the Albany Stuarts. The former governing family was arrested. Its leading members were tried for treason. Several of them were executed. Their lands were confiscated. The king then proceeded against other magnates whose power had expanded during the long royal absence. This was vigorous government. It was also an excellent way to persuade several noble families that their continued survival depended upon the king's immediate death. James I possessed many of the qualities later displayed by James II. He was intelligent, he was capable, he understood the weaknesses of the crown, and he believed that royal authority could be restored by frightening, prosecuting, impoverishing, or executing everyone who had benefited from its decline. This strategy worked beautifully until the people being frightened, prosecuted, impoverished, and executed began comparing notes with each other. In February 1437, James was staying at the Dominican Friary in Perth. A group of conspirators led by Sir Robert Graham entered the building. The king attempted to escape by lifting the floorboards and lowering himself into a vault connected to a drain. At first glance, this seems like an undignified arrangement for a medieval sovereign, but dignity becomes a secondary consideration when armed relatives are searching the building with swords. Unfortunately, the drain had been blocked. According to the famous story, James himself had ordered the exit to be sealed because tennis balls kept disappearing into it. The King of Scots had inadvertently converted his own escape route into a royal sporting improvement. Trapped beneath the floor, he was discovered by the assassins. James fought desperately, but he was unarmed. The conspirators stabbed him repeatedly and killed him in the vault. He was 42 years old. The first of the 5 Jameses had become king at age 11, spent 18 years in captivity, ruled Scotland for 13 years, and died hiding in a sewer because of a tennis-related infrastructure decision. The crown then passed to his 6-year-old son. James II therefore began his reign with the lesson that Scottish kings could be murdered in their bedrooms, their monasteries, or beneath the floorboards. As we have already seen, his childhood produced the Black Dinner. His adulthood produced the murder of William Douglas. His campaign against the Black Douglases strengthened the monarchy and left him by his late 20s in a more commanding position than any Scottish king had enjoyed for years. And then, in 1460, he went to besiege Roxburgh Castle. Roxburgh was one of the last great English-held fortresses remaining inside the Scottish border. And James, of course, brought with him a very impressive artillery train. He was fascinated by cannons and understood their revolutionary potential. For centuries, a rebellious noble or foreign garrison could shelter safely behind stone walls and force the king into a very long, very expensive siege. Gunpowder artillery was changing that calculation. A sufficiently large cannon could turn hereditary feudal independence into gravel in a matter of moments. James supervised the bombardment personally. This demonstrated courage, technical interest, and an unfortunate misunderstanding of workplace safety. One of the Scottish cannon exploded. A piece of the weapon struck the king, breaking his thigh and killing his ass. He was 29 years old. James II had survived aristocratic conspiracy, royal kidnapping, the Black Dinner, civil war, and the destruction of Scotland's greatest noble house. He was then killed by equipment he had brought to destroy somebody else's castle. The crown passed to his 9-year-old son. James III inherited a monarchy strengthened by his father's victories. He also inherited the traditional Scottish arrangement in which rival nobles competed to control the king until the king became old enough to retaliate. His reign proved to be deeply troubled. James possessed interests considered unusual for a warrior monarch. He favored artists, musicians, architects, and men of relatively humble birth. These are admirable qualities in a Renaissance prince. They are less helpful when one's aristocracy believes the royal patronage is a fixed resource being stolen from them by foreign fiddlers. James became increasingly unpopular among sections of the nobility. He quarreled with his brothers. He distrusted major magnates. His favorites attracted resentment. And his government acquired the fatal appearance of a small court faction attempting to rule without the cooperation of the political class. In 1482, while Scotland faced an English invasion, James's own nobles arrested him at Lauder Bridge. Several of his favorites were seized. According to tradition, they were hanged from the bridge before the king's eyes. James himself was taken into custody. Once again, the King of Scots became a prisoner inside his own kingdom. He recovered authority, but never fully recovered the confidence of the nobility. By 1488, another rebellion had formed against him. This time, the rebels placed James's own 15-year-old son at their head. The prince was not necessarily directing the movement, but his presence gave the rebellion what every successful aristocratic conspiracy requires: a plausible replacement wearing the correct surname. The opposing forces met at the Battle of Sackeysburn. James III's army was soundly defeated. The king fled the battlefield. What happened next is uncertain in its details and magnificently Scottish in every surviving version. James may have fallen from his horse. He may have been taken refuge in a cottage. A man posing as a priest may have entered and killed him, or he may simply have been murdered during the confused aftermath of the battle. What is certain is that James III was dead at the age of 36. The rebellion conducted in his son's name had thus succeeded, and the 15-year-old prince became James IV. The son had inherited the throne through the destruction of his father. That is the kind of succession Westeros generally accompanies with ominous music and a raven landing on a battlement. James IV appears to have felt genuine guilt over the circumstances of his accession. According to tradition, he wore an iron chain around his waist as an act of penance, adding another link to it each year. Whether every detail of the story is literal or a later embellishment, the image endured because it fit his reign. James IV carried the moral burden of his father's death. He also became one of the most capable of the Stuart kings. He strengthened royal government. He supported education. He patronized printing. He encouraged medicine and shipbuilding. He expanded the navy. He traveled widely through his kingdom. He dealt energetically with the Western Highlands and the remaining power of the Lords of the Isles. He was intelligent, charismatic, physically courageous, politically active, and sufficiently curious to have a court dentist experiment upon his own teeth. For once, Scotland appeared to have received an adult king with the ability and longevity to rule effectively. So naturally, he invaded England. In 1513, Henry VIII went to war with France. James IV was bound to France by the Old Alliance and faced pressure to draw English forces away from the continent. He assembled one of the largest armies Scotland had ever placed in the field and proceeded to cross the border. The campaign culminated at Flodden. The Scots occupied a very strong position. They possessed formidable artillery. James commanded a substantial host, and then the battle became a catastrophe. The Scottish army descended from favorable ground and engaged the English at close quarters. Its long pikes, effective when used in disciplined formation, became difficult to handle upon broken terrain, and the fighting turned savage. James IV did not direct the battle from a safe distance, though. He fought personally, right near the front. This was courageous. It was also inspirational. And from the standpoint of dynastic continuity, it was something close to criminal negligence. Because the king was killed, around him died much of the Scottish nobility. Earls, lords, churchmen, knights, and local leaders fell in enormous numbers. Almost every important family in the kingdom lost somebody. Flodden was not merely a military defeat, it was the mass decapitation of the Scottish political nation. There were households across Scotland in which the messenger brought news that the father, the eldest son, the younger brother, and several cousins had all died on the same afternoon. James IV was 40 years old. He had reigned for 25 years, and at the moment of his death, his legitimate heir was 17 months old. And the crown passed to James V. At this point, the pattern should have been obvious. A child inherits, the nobles form factions, somebody controls the regency, the king grows older amid conspiracy, he attempts to recover royal authority, everyone prepares for the next funeral. James V's minority featured struggles among his mother, Margaret Tudor, her second husband, the Earl of Angus, the Duke of Albany, and various aristocratic factions competing to govern through the infant king. Margaret Tudor was the sister of Henry VIII. This made James V the nephew of the English king. It did not make Anglo-Scottish relations noticeably less violent. For several years, the Earl of Angus effectively controlled both the government and the young monarch. James came to regard himself as something of a prisoner. In 1528, at the age of 16, he escaped from Douglas control and began ruling personally. His response was entirely in keeping with Stuart family tradition. He moved against the Douglases, drove Angus into exile, confiscated estates, and demonstrated that holding a young Scottish king against his will was a sound short-term investment, followed by a disastrous retirement plan. James V strengthened administration and royal justice. He married into the French royal world. He cultivated Renaissance magnificence. He also developed a reputation for severity, suspicion, and hostility toward magnates who might threaten the crown. The old structural problem remained. The king needed the nobility. The king feared the nobility. The nobility understood both facts and priced its loyalty accordingly. Relations with England deteriorated. In 1542, a Scottish force suffered a humiliating defeat at Solway Moss. The battle itself was less a grand slaughter than a collapse of command, morale, and aristocratic confidence. Many Scottish nobles were captured. James was not personally present, but the failure struck at the heart of his authority. Soon afterward, he fell seriously ill. Later tradition transformed his final days into a death from grief and despair. The historical reality was probably less poetic and more medical. James appears to have already been suffering from illness, perhaps an infection, aggravated by exhaustion and political crisis. He withdrew to Falkland Palace. There, on the 14th of December, 1542, he died at the age of 30. 6 days earlier, his wife, Mary of Guise, had given birth to a daughter. According to a famous later account, James received the news that the child was female and remarked that the Stuart dynasty had come through a woman and would end with a woman. He then turned his face to the wall. Whether he spoke those exact words is uncertain. Scottish history has a tendency to provide dying kings with dialogue suspiciously well-suited to future textbooks. But the succession itself was real enough. James V was dead. His 2 infant sons had died the previous year. His only surviving legitimate child was less than 1 week old. And so Mary, Queen of Scots, inherited the kingdom at the age of 6 days. The five Jameses had ruled Scotland for 136 years. James I became king at 11 and was assassinated beneath a floor. James II became king at 6 and was killed by an exploding cannon. James III became king at 9 and was murdered during a rebellion led in the name of his son. James IV became king at 15 and was slaughtered with his nobility at Flodden. James V became king as an infant and died sick, defeated, and 30 years old. They were not uniformly bad kings. Several of them, in fact, were pretty capable. Some of them were intelligent. At least 2 of them were genuinely formidable, but ability offered no immunity from the machinery of Scottish politics. A king could centralize the government, crush a rival house, build a navy, patronize learning, or create the strongest artillery train in the country. But sooner or later, someone entered the chamber with a knife, the army marched into unsuitable terrain, or the damn cannon exploded. This is what makes the Stuart dynasty feel so recognizably Targaryen-ish. The tragedy is not simply that individual rulers die. The tragedy is that each death creates the conditions for the next disaster. A murdered king leaves a child. The child is controlled by regents. The regents enrich their families. The adult king takes revenge. The revenge produces rebellion. The rebellion kills the king, and the crown duly passes to another small child. The dynasty does not move forward, it circles. Every generation inherits not only the throne, but the unresolved violence of the generation before it. And now, after 5 consecutive King Jameses, Scotland had reached the logical conclusion of the system. The throne belonged to a newborn girl. The nobles were already forming factions. England was already considering how the child might be used. France was already considering how she might be protected. And Mary herself was still several years away from being old enough to understand that half of Europe was arranging her marriage and the other half was planning to prevent it. The curse of the 5 Jameses was over. The tragedy of Mary, Queen of Scots, was just beginning. Chapter 6, The 6-Day Queen. Mary Stuart entered the world at Linlithgow Palace on the 8th of December, 1542. 6 days later, her father died. And so, before she had developed the muscular strength necessary to hold up her own head, Mary became Queen of Scots. This was the final refinement of the Stuart system. Previous kings had inherited at 11, 6, 9, 15, and 17 months. Mary eliminated the unnecessary delay. She inherited before completing her first week. At 6 days old, she possessed 2 kingdoms worth of dynastic claims, several prospective husbands, an assortment of mortal enemies, and no useful control over her bowels. Scotland had reached peak monarchy. James V's death left the country in the hands of another regency, another divided nobility, and another royal child whose marriage could determine the political alignment of Britain. The question was not whether Mary would marry. The question was which foreign power would obtain Scotland by marrying her. Henry VIII wanted the infant queen betrothed to his son Edward. On paper, the arrangement offered peace. Mary would marry the English heir. The crowns might eventually be united. The long, exhausting history of Anglo-Scottish warfare could give way to dynastic cooperation. Unfortunately, Henry VIII's idea of courtship involved burning down whichever country happened to contain the bride. When the Scots rejected the English match and renewed their alliance with France, Henry launched the series of invasions remembered as the Rough Wooing. English forces burned towns, abbeys, crops, and villages in an effort to persuade Scotland that marriage into the Tudor family was a pleasant and voluntary opportunity. This remains among the least successful applications of flowers and chocolates diplomacy in all of European history. The Scots responded by sending Mary to France. In 1548, at the age of 5, she sailed away from the kingdom she nominally ruled and entered the French royal court. She was betrothed to Francis, the heir to Henry II. She was educated as a French princess, surrounded by the language, ceremony, religion, and sophistication of one of Europe's great courts. It was during this period that the family spelling shifted from Stuart with a W to Stuart with a U, because French does not contain the letter W and was therefore unwilling to pronounce the Scottish royal family without administrative assistance. Mary grew into an accomplished young woman. She was tall by the standards of her age, intelligent, musically educated, fluent in several languages, skilled at riding, and accustomed to a court considerably more polished than anything that was awaiting her back home. At 15, she married the Dauphin. The following year, Henry II died, and Francis became King of France. Mary, still in her teens, was now both Queen of Scots and Queen Consort of the French. For one brief moment, her dynastic position appeared almost impossibly strong. She had been born sovereign of one kingdom. She had married the sovereign of another. She possessed a plausible hereditary claim to a third, and she was closely connected to the most powerful Catholic dynasty in all of Western Europe. Naturally, Francis died the following year, because of course he did. He was 16, Mary was 18. The great Franco-Scottish future vanished with an ear infection. Once again, Mary was a queen without effective control of her kingdom. But now she was also a widow without a secure place at the French court. And so in 1561, after 13 years abroad, Mary returned to Scotland. She arrived in a country she had not seen since childhood. It had changed profoundly in her absence. Scotland was now officially Protestant. The old Catholic religious establishment had been overthrown. The fiery reformer John Knox regarded the public exercise of Catholic worship as idolatry and the government of women as an offense against the divinely ordained arrangement of the universe. Mary was female, Catholic, French-educated, and fond of dancing. To Knox, she was essentially the four horsemen of the apocalypse, wearing a well-cut gown. And yet, Mary's early personal rule was more successful than the catastrophe that followed has sometimes allowed us to remember. She accepted the political reality of the Reformation. She did not attempt an immediate Catholic restoration. She relied upon experienced Protestant advisors, including her half-brother Lord James Stuart, later the Earl of Moray, and William Maitland of Lethington. She traveled throughout her kingdom, dispensed justice, cultivated support, and demonstrated considerable political restraint. The 20-year-old queen did not return to Scotland and instantly destroy herself. That took several years, and a man named Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was Mary's cousin. He was handsome, he was tall, he possessed royal blood, and he had a claim to the English succession. On the dynastic marriage market, this constituted a very impressive resume. Unfortunately, resumes do not generally include a section marked character defects likely to produce civil war. Mary married Darnley in July of 1565. The attraction appears to have been a genuine one, at least initially. Politically, the match consolidated both of their claims to the English throne. Both were descendants of Henry VII. Any child they produced would possess a formidable hereditary claim after Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was therefore furious. Several Scottish nobles were alarmed. Mary's half-brother Moray rebelled and was driven into exile, and Darnley began revealing that beneath the attractive exterior lay a vain, unstable, arrogant young man who wanted the powers of kingship without the inconvenience of earning anyone's confidence. He demanded the crown matrimonial, which would have allowed him to continue exercising royal authority should Mary happen to die before him. Mary refused. Darnley grew resentful. The marriage deteriorated, and into the widening space between husband and wife stepped a man named David Riccio. Riccio was an Italian musician who had risen to become Mary's private secretary. He was intelligent, useful, foreign, Catholic, and very close to the Queen. This made him intensely unpopular among Protestant nobles who disliked foreign Catholics, royal favorites, competent secretaries, or anyone receiving influence they believed properly belonged to them. Rumors spread that Riccio was Mary's lover. There is no persuasive evidence that he was, but evidence is the least important component of a useful political rumor. Darnley allowed himself to be drawn into a conspiracy. On the evening of March 9th, 1566, Mary was dining in a small supper chamber at Holyrood Palace. She was approximately 6 months pregnant. Darnley entered and sat beside her. Then armed conspirators forced their way into the room. Riccio attempted to shelter behind the Queen. The attackers dragged him away. He was stabbed repeatedly and left dead nearby, while Mary was held prisoner inside her own palace. Darnley had helped armed men invade his pregnant wife's chamber and murder her secretary right in front of her. This was not merely domestic cruelty, it was a political coup. The conspirators intended to remove Mary's advisors, dominate her government, restore exiled nobles, and rule through Darnley. Once again, possession of the royal person meant possession of royal authority. Once again, the monarch became a prisoner inside the monarch's own residence. And once again, the people conducting the conspiracy had overlooked the possibility that the captive Stuart might escape and devote the remainder of her life to exacting revenge. Mary persuaded Darnley that the conspirators intended to discard him once he had served their purpose. This was almost certainly true. Together, the royal couple escaped from Holyrood. The rebellion collapsed. Mary recovered control, and 3 months later, she gave birth to a son. The child was named James. He would become James VI of Scotland. He would eventually inherit the English throne as James I, and he would accomplish the dynastic union that Henry VIII had attempted to secure through military invasion. The union of the crowns would ultimately be achieved not by Edward marrying Mary, but by Mary's son patiently outliving Elizabeth. For Darnley, however, the birth of an heir made his own position even more precarious. He had betrayed his wife. He had failed his fellow conspirators. He was hated by much of the nobility, and he was now no longer necessary for the continuation of the dynasty. By early 1567, Darnley was staying at a house called Kirklefield outside Edinburgh's city walls. He had been ill. Mary visited him. Arrangements were apparently being made for some degree of reconciliation. Then, during the early morning hours of February 10th, the house exploded. The blast destroyed the building, but Darnley's body was found outside in a nearby garden. He did not appear to have been killed by the explosion, but the precise manner of his death remains disputed, though the general conclusion was obvious. Someone had arranged the destruction of the house while ensuring that Darnley did not escape from it alive. The murder of a royal consort would ordinarily be the principal scandal of a reign. For Mary, it became merely the opening act. Suspicion fell heavily upon James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was powerful, aggressive, politically ambitious, and closely connected to the Queen. He was tried for Darnley's murder. The proceeding was a hurried one. The prosecution was weak, and Bothwell was thus acquitted. This did not convince anyone who had previously thought him guilty, though. It merely demonstrated that a powerful Scottish lord could survive a murder charge provided he arrived at court with enough armed friends. Then came the event that has divided historians, biographers, propagandists, romantics, and filmmakers ever since. Bothwell intercepted Mary while she was traveling. He took her to Dunbar Castle. Contemporary accounts described the episode as an abduction. Whether Mary was forcibly carried away, politically coerced, sexually assaulted, acting in concert with Bothwell, or some shifting combination of all those circumstances, remains fiercely disputed. What is beyond dispute is that Mary got married to him in May of 1567. It was 3 months after the murder of Darnley. Bothwell was the man most widely suspected of arranging it, and Mary's decision or submission to marry him destroyed what remained of her political authority. Even some nobles who had signed documents approving the match now discovered that they were morally outraged. This is another durable feature of aristocratic politics. The nobility encourages a disastrous royal decision. The monarch makes the decision. The nobility then rebels on the grounds that no responsible nobility could possibly tolerate such a decision. The Confederate lords raised an army. Mary and Bothwell confronted them at Carberry Hill in June. Though no great battle occurred, Bothwell was allowed to leave, and Mary surrendered. She was taken through Edinburgh as a prisoner, abused by the crowds, and confined at Lochleven Castle on an island in the middle of a lake. The Queen of Scots had become the captive of her own subjects. At Lochleven, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her 13-month-old son. James VI was crowned at Stirling. The Earl of Moray became regent. Scotland had replaced its 6-day-old queen with a 1-year-old king, thereby correcting the principal defect of the previous government. The baby had been the wrong sex. Mary spent nearly a year imprisoned at Lochleven. She then accomplished one of the great escapes in Scottish history. With assistance from members of the Douglas household, she crossed the lake by boat on the night of May the 2nd, 1568. Supporters rallied around her. Within days, she had assembled thousands of men and revoked the abdication that was extracted during her captivity. For one brief moment, it appeared that Mary might regain her throne. But then her army was defeated at Langside. 13 days after escaping from Lochleven, she was once again a queen without a kingdom. Mary now made the most consequential miscalculation of her life, which was to flee south into England because she expected assistance from Elizabeth I. The two queens were relatives. Both were sovereign women ruling amid aristocratic hostility. Mary believed that Elizabeth would recognize the danger of allowing subjects to depose an anointed monarch. And in principle, Elizabeth did recognize that danger. In practice, though, Mary presented her with an impossible problem. To restore Mary in Scotland, Elizabeth might strengthen a Catholic rival who also had a claim on the English succession. Release Mary, and she might travel abroad, obtain foreign support, and return at the head of an invading army. Send her back to the Scottish lords, and Elizabeth would appear to endorse rebellion against monarchy. Keep her in England, and Mary would become a permanent rallying point for everyone who wanted Elizabeth removed. Elizabeth selected the option that postponed the decision. She merely imprisoned her. Not in a dungeon, generally speaking. Mary maintained a household. She had servants, possessions, correspondence, occasional recreation, and accommodations that were suited to her rank, but she could not leave. She moved between castles and manor houses under heavy guard, and she remained there for 19 years. Mary arrived in England at the age of 25. She died there at the age of 44. During those years, she became more dangerous in symbol than she ever had been in government. To English Catholics who considered Elizabeth illegitimate, Mary was the rightful heir. To foreign Catholic powers, she was an alternative queen. To plotters, she was the name around which rebellion could be organized. To Elizabeth's ministers, she was a loaded crossbow lying permanently on the table. Mary did not have to initiate every conspiracy formed on her behalf. Her existence made the conspiracies possible. For years, Elizabeth resisted demands for her execution. Killing Mary meant killing an anointed queen. It established the principle that a sovereign could be judged and executed by another sovereign's government. It risked international outrage, and it would make Mary a Catholic martyr. But Elizabeth's chief intelligence minister, Francis Walsingham, was determined to obtain proof that Mary had personally approved a plot against Queen Elizabeth's life. In 1586, he got it. Anthony Babington and his associates planned to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, encourage rebellion, and place the Scottish queen upon the English throne. Mary's secret correspondence was carried in coded messages concealed in beer barrels. Unfortunately, the entire channel had been perpetrated by Walsingham's agents. The letters were intercepted, deciphered, copied, resealed, and delivered. Mary believed she was communicating secretly with her supporters. In reality, she was composing evidence for the prosecution. In the letter that became known as the Gallows Letter, Mary approved the broader plan and discussed the proposed killing of Elizabeth. Walsingham's cryptographer drew a small gallows upon the document. This was 16th century intelligence work conducted with the subtle visual restraint of a political cartoon. Mary was arrested, tried at Fotheringay Castle, and duly convicted. She denied that an English court possessed jurisdiction over a foreign anointed queen. She argued that she was not an English subject and could not therefore commit treason against Elizabeth. Legally, the case was an unprecedented one. Politically, the result was predetermined. Elizabeth signed the death warrant, because of course she did. Then, with the characteristic ambiguity that had preserved her rule for decades, she appeared horrified when her ministers acted upon the document that she herself had signed. Mary was informed on the 7th of February, 1587, that she would die the following morning. She spent the night praying, writing letters, distributing possessions, and preparing herself. When she entered the Great Hall at Fotheringay, she did so with the composure of someone determined to control the only part of the ceremony still available to her, and that was the performance. Mary had failed as a politician. She would not fail as a queen. The scaffold was draped in black. The block was covered in black. The officials were assembled. A Protestant clergyman attempted to pray over her. Mary refused to join his worship and prayed aloud in Latin according to her Catholic faith. She forgave the executioners. She bade farewell to her servants. Then her ladies helped remove her black outer garments. Beneath them appeared crimson clothing. Whether every modern description of the outfit as a consciously chosen martyr's red can be proven is debatable, but nobody present could have missed the theatrical effect. The black-clad prisoner had been transformed into a Catholic queen, prepared to shed her blood. Mary had spent much of her life being used as a symbol by other people. At the end, she selected the symbol herself. She knelt. She placed her head upon the block. She stretched out her arms, and she repeated in Latin, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner struck. The first blow did not complete the beheading. A second stroke was required, followed by the cutting of the remaining tissue. Then the executioner raised Mary's head to show the witnesses. Her false hair and head dressing came away, revealing short gray hair beneath, which proves that among the many preparations necessary for a dignified royal execution, someone had neglected to verify whether the ceremonial wig was a load-bearing one. The attempt at triumphant display had produced one of the final moments of grotesque incompetence. Even in death, Scottish royal history refused to proceed cleanly. A contemporary account also records that Mary's small dog had hidden beneath her clothing and would not leave the body until it was forcibly removed. Everything stained with her blood was washed or burned to prevent supporters from collecting relics. Mary, Queen of Scots, was 44 years old. She had been queen for all but 6 days of her life. She had been Queen of France for less than 18 months. She had ruled Scotland personally for approximately 6 years. She had spent nearly 20 years imprisoned in England. She was born into one of the strongest hereditary positions in Europe and died upon a scaffold in another queen's castle. And yet, the dynasty survived. Mary's son remained King of Scots. Elizabeth never married. She produced no heir. When she died in 1603, the English crown passed peacefully to James VI. The child in whose favor Mary had been deposed thus became James I of England. The son of the executed queen inherited the kingdom of the queen who executed her. Mary lost Scotland. She never obtained England, but her bloodline obtained both. There is no exact equivalent to Mary in A Song of Ice and Fire, nor does there really need to be. She contains elements recognizable throughout Martin's world. The child sovereign treated as a dynastic asset. The young woman married for political advantage, the foreign-raised queen returning to a divided homeland, the beautiful husband whose character proves catastrophically unequal to his pedigree, the intimate murder inside the royal apartments, the consort killed under mysterious circumstances, the suspected murderer who becomes the queen's next husband, the nobles who first advise and then condemn, the forced abdication, the infant king, the imprisoned claimant, the rival queens who can neither coexist nor safely destroy one another. Mary's life demonstrates why Martin's women often face political constraints that are far different from those confronting the male characters. A male ruler's marriage may cause problems. A female ruler's marriage can determine who is believed to govern. Every husband becomes a potential king. Every pregnancy becomes an affair of state. Every favorite becomes a rumored lover. Every act of leniency can be called weakness. Every act of force can be called unnatural. Mary possessed intelligence, courage, charm, education, dynastic legitimacy, and at moments, real political skill. None of those qualities freed her from the structure that was surrounding her, though. She was born a queen, but from infancy onward, other people attempted to decide where she would live, whom she would marry, what religion her kingdom would follow, which men could approach her, whether she could retain her crown, and finally, whether she could retain her head. If this were fiction, it would be criticized as excessive. The murdered secretary, the exploded husband, the marriage to the suspected killer, the island prison, the midnight escape, the failed battle, the 19-year captivity, the coded plot, the rival queen, the red dress, the botched beheading, the detachable wig. An editor would send the manuscript back with a note reading, "Powerful material, but perhaps reduced the number of catastrophes in the second half." Scottish history, though, had no editor, and Mary's execution did not end the tradition of hospitality violated, promises broken, and political enemies murdered under the protection of those they trusted. For the final precursor to the Red Wedding, we must move forward a century, to a Highland glen, to a winter night, and to a company of soldiers who ate beneath their victims' roofs before rising to kill them. Chapter 7, The Other Red Wedding. More than a century after Mary, Queen of Scots, lost her head, Scotland produced one final contribution to the Red Wedding. By 1692, the Stuart King James VII of Scotland and II of England had been overthrown and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. Many Highland clans remained sympathetic to the exiled James. These supporters became known as Jacobites, from Jacobus, the Latin form of James. William's government wanted the Highlands to be pacified. The clan chiefs were ordered to swear allegiance before January the 1st, 1692. Those who complied would receive a pardon. Those who did not would be treated as traitors. The chief of the Glencoe MacDonalds was Alistair MacLean MacDonald. He was not refusing the oath. He was merely late in taking it. James delayed granting his followers permission to submit, and word reached Glencoe with only days remaining before the deadline. MacLean struggled through winter weather to reach Fort William, only to discover that the officer there was not authorized to administer the oath. He was thus redirected to Inverary, approximately 16 miles away. Maclean finally swore allegiance on January 6th. He believed the oath had been accepted and that his people were safe. The government decided otherwise. The Glencoe MacDonalds were small enough to destroy, unpopular enough to isolate, and conveniently late enough to serve as an example. At the beginning of February, approximately 120 government soldiers from the Earl of Argyll's regiment arrived in Glencoe under Captain Robert Campbell of Glen Lyon. This is usually remembered as Campbell's massacring MacDonalds in the continuation of an ancient clan feud. There was certainly bad blood between the families, but reducing Glencoe to tribal revenge lets the government off far too easily. Only a small number of the soldiers were in fact Campbell's. This was actually a state operation. The order came through the military chain of command. The regiment was merely the instrument. The MacDonalds were told that the soldiers had come to collect taxes and required lodging. For nearly 2 weeks, the people of Glencoe housed them. They shared their food. They shared their fires. They drank together. They played games. They lived beneath the same roofs. The soldiers were not an army approaching across the mountains. They were guests already inside the victims' homes. On the evening of February 12th, Glen Lyon received his true orders. At 5 o'clock the following morning, his men were to fall upon the MacDonalds, secure the exits from the glen, and ensure that the clan leadership did not escape. The soldiers rose before dawn on February 13th. Maclean was shot as he climbed from his bed. Elsewhere, musket fire tore through the doors and windows of houses in which the soldiers had been entertained only hours earlier. Men were dragged outside and killed. Homes were burned. Women, children, and elderly people fled into the mountains in the middle of a Highland winter. 38 members and associates of the clan were killed directly. Others died from exposure after escaping into the snow. Some soldiers appear to have warned their hosts or deliberately permitted them to flee beforehand. Even men carrying out the order understood that something more shameful than ordinary warfare was taking place here. This was what made Glencoe infamous. People had been killed in Scotland before. Indeed, this entire monologue has been arranged around the difficulty of finding anyone who had not. The horror was not merely the murder, it was murder under the guise of trust. The MacDonalds had admitted the soldiers beneath their roofs. Highland hospitality created obligations between host and guest, even when the men involved belonged to rival families. For nearly 2 weeks, those obligations had been duly observed. Then the guests rose before daylight and attempted to exterminate the people who had been feeding them. A later Scottish inquiry formally condemned the massacre as a murder committed under trust, although most of the men responsible escaped any meaningful punishment. George Martin has identified Glencoe and the Black Dinner as the two principal Scottish events behind the Red Wedding. The Black Dinner supplied the feast, the invitation, and the destruction of a noble family after promises of safety. Glencoe supplied the more intimate betrayal. The killers were not strangers crashing through the gates. They had eaten the victims' food and slept beside their fires. Martin combined the two events, moved the setting to a wedding, locked the doors, and provided a band sufficiently well rehearsed to know precisely when to begin playing the Rains of Castamere. The Red Wedding feels uniquely horrifying because it violates one of the few rules supposedly recognized even by enemies. Once a guest has eaten beneath your roof, the feud pauses. Without that principle, diplomacy becomes impossible. Negotiation becomes impossible. Reconciliation becomes impossible. Every invitation is a potential ambush. Every meal is a weapons inspection with gravy. The sacred nature of guest right is not sentimental medieval decoration. It is a practical technology for allowing violent people to occupy the same room without immediately testing the table knives. Destroy that trust, and politics collapses into permanent war. The Black Dinner broke it in a royal castle. James II broke it with a written safe conduct. Glencoe broke it in private homes. And the enduring lesson of Scottish Westeros is that the customs protecting civilization are only as strong as the ambition of the person who finds them inconvenient. The MacDonalds were not destroyed at Glencoe. Many of them escaped. The government failed in its effort to eliminate the community. But the massacre succeeded in creating something more durable than political obedience. It created cultural memory. Kings changed, governments changed, the Jacobite cause rose and fell, but Glencoe survived as a warning carried through generations. that the enemy outside your door may be dangerous, but the enemy sleeping beside your fire is often something worse. Epilogue. The country George Martin did not have to invent. And that brings us back to Westeros. The political skeleton may owe much to the anarchy and the Wars of the Roses, but in Scotland we find an extraordinary concentration of the elements that give Martin's world such a rich texture. A crown that controls less territory than the map suggests, great houses capable of challenging the king, children inheriting thrones surrounded by adults who intend to rule through them, island princes who behave as independent sovereigns, royal promises violated inside royal castles, dynasties trapped in cycles of murder, minority, regency, revenge, and rebellion, queens transformed into marriage contracts, guests slaughtered by their hosts, hosts slaughtered by their guests, and one king blown apart by his own canon because occasionally history recognizes that the symbolism is already strong enough. This does not mean Scotland was the original secret model for every kingdom, family, and catastrophe in A Song of Ice and Fire. History does not work that neatly, and neither does George Martin. He gathers fragments. A succession crisis from 12th century England, a civil war from 15th century England, a feast from Edinburgh Castle, a massacre from a Highland glen, a wall from a Roman frontier, a dragon from mythology. Then he asks what human beings would actually do with them. That is the achievement. The dragons do not make Westeros believable. The people do that. Aegon's dragons may amount to William the Conqueror acquiring an air force, but once the conquest is complete, the problems remain recognizably human. How does a king govern distant regions? How does a dynasty survive a child monarch? How much power can one noble family accumulate before the crown must destroy it? What happens when law collides with necessity? And what remains of civilization when promises cease to mean anything? Scotland spent centuries providing the answers, usually very bloody ones. And that is why history can astonish people who are encountering it for the first time. If you submitted the Five Jameses, the Black Dinner, the Murder at Stirling, the Lords of the Isles, Mary's Reign, and Glencoe as a fantasy manuscript, an editor would tell you, maybe dial down the melodrama a little bit. Too many child kings, too many murdered guests, too many disastrous marriages, too many suspicious explosions, and surely no reputable dynasty could repeatedly leave the entire kingdom to a goddamn infant, but that all happened. Because George Martin's greatest insight was not that real history resembles fantasy. It was that fantasy had never been willing to go as far as real history already had. Westeros is brutal, treacherous, and frequently absurd, and so was Scotland. The principal difference is that Scotland managed it without dragons. And now, like a grand maester setting down his quill, we close the book on Curmudgeon's Field Guide to Scottish Westeros, and I dutifully transmit you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.
This one's for you, buddy. Nice.
Down in Wester Hollow where the country folk plotting, it's king of the porch, but his seat's getting hot. John's the half-son, his roots kind of cross, and he's dreaming of a man whose teeth ain't all lost. Arya's in the yard swinging knives at a tree, and Bran's rolling round since he fell from that old TV. Out in Wester Hollow where the trailers lay, the Lannisters and Starks all fight every day. Everybody's related in this tangled up scene. King of the trailer park, that's the redneck dream. Cersei's in the yard winking at her kin. Jaime's with his sister and it ain't no sin. Tyrion's small as a stump but drinks like a mule. He's guzzling down beer while y'all act the fool. Towns pulling strings, scheming in the dark. The mountains crushing folks, just tearing them apart. Out in Wester Hollow where the trailers lay, the Lannisters and Starks all fight every day. Everybody's related in this tangled up scene. King of the trailer park, that's the redneck dream. Joffrey's barking orders, making folks kneel, but the holler's got eyes and his face sealed. Little fingers pimping girls, dealing in the shade. Varys hears it all, but silence gets him paid. Daenerys rolls up slow with gators by her side. Swamp Queen's in charge and she's ready to ride. Out in Wester Hollow where the trailers lay, the Lannisters and Starks all fight every day. Everybody's related in this tangled up scene. King of the trailer park, that's the redneck dream. Stan is holding tight, claiming he's the king, but down in the holler no one cares about a thing. Melisandre's lighting candles, preaching real odd, while Jon's still wondering if he's even Ned's squad. Hoder's just holding the door, bless his simple brain, but in the game of trailers only the ruthless remain. Out in Wester Hollow where the trailers lay, the Lannisters and Starks all fight every day. Everybody's related in this tangled up scene. King of the trailer park, that's the redneck dream.
Jeez, and it's that time already because I used up the entire damn show with my damn monologue. I didn't think it was going to be that long. I knew it was going to be pretty long and pretty unwieldy, but I do feel kind of bad that my co-host didn't even need to say anything tonight. But oh my God, that was the best video I've ever seen. You get an absolute enthusiastic double high five from me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for joining us here on the Blast Radius, even though it was a monologue only Blast Radius. I'm actually kind of pleased with the monologue. Hope you all enjoyed it too. We will see you next week. Same time, same place, Sunday night, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. We'll talk about some stuff, and it won't just be me reading a teleprompter the entire time, I promise. It was a fun thing to do once. That's the longest monologue I've ever attempted in my entire natural-born life. But next week we'll do something more normal and more traditional. We will hope you have a great tomorrow and the next day and a fantastic rest of your week, and we will see you next time. Take care. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.